In the gilded heart of Chicago, where fortunes were forged in steel and whispered away over plates of Michelin-starred art, a young woman was about to choose between her job and her humanity. She saw a solitary old woman, dressed in the quiet dignity of someone the world had long since stopped noticing, wrestling with a silent, invisible cage. While everyone else saw a nuisance, a difficult customer slowing down the lucrative rhythm of the night, the waitress saw a flicker of a person trapped inside. With a single act of radical patience, she would reach into that silence, unknowingly unlocking a saga of familial betrayal, profound loneliness, and a truth so raw it could shatter an empire. What she did next wouldn't just earn her a tip. It would detonate a carefully constructed lie and rewrite her own destiny. The main dining room of Aurelia, perched 63 floors above the magnificent Mile, was less a restaurant and more a temple to success. The silence here was a cultivated luxury, a gentle symphony composed of the discreet clink of hand-forged silverware on porcelain, the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals, and the sigh of Lake Michigan's win against soundproof glass. For Clara Mayhew, this silence was a currency she couldn't afford. At 22, she moved through this opulent theater with a practiced serenity that masked the frantic calculus of survival. Her crisp black uniform was an armor against the reality of her life. A third-floor walk-up in Pilsen, a mountain of inherited medical debt, and the ever-present ghost of her grandfather's voice, lost to the labyrinth of a stroke years ago. Every dollar Clara earned from patrons who spent her monthly rent on a single glass of wine went toward chipping away at that debt and clinging to the faded dream of one day finishing the speech pathology degree she'd had to abandon. Tonight, the ambient electricity in Aurelia was amplified by the presence of a titan, Alistair Finch. At 38, Alistair was the architect of a global logistics empire, a man who had inherited a respectable family fortune and multiplied it tenfold with a combination of technological genius and surgical ruthlessness. He was a figure of myth in the city, rarely seen, his face more familiar from the pages of Forbes than from any society column. He stood at the far end of the long marble bar, a statue of bespoke tailoring and coiled tension, his gaze the color of a winter lake, missing nothing. He wasn't dining. He was observing. His focus was a small, two-top table near the vast windows. Seated there was an elderly woman, her gray hair pulled back in a simple, neat bun. She wore a lavender knit cardigan, impeccably clean, but decades out of style, in sensible flat shoes. She could have been anyone's grandmother, a tourist who had wandered into the wrong establishment. But Clara, who had a knack for noticing the details others missed, saw the quiet quality of the woman's leather handbag and the single, elegant gold watch on her wrist. This was not a woman who was lost. This was a woman who was hiding in plain sight. This was Eleanor Finch, Alistair's mother and the silent matriarch of the Finch dynasty. The restaurant's manager, a perpetually flustered man named Mr. Dubois, was sweating under the pressure. He approached Eleanor's table with the kind of forced, patronizing smile reserved for the elderly and the confused. "Good evening, madam. Are we ready to order?" he asked, speaking slowly and loudly, as if she were hard of hearing. Eleanor Finch looked up at him, her eyes a startlingly clear blue, filled with an intelligent light that seemed at war with the rest of her demeanor. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words that came out were a frustrating tangle of sounds, a ghost of the sentence she intended. What? She gestured toward the menu, her hand trembling slightly with the effort, a flush of deep, painful embarrassment coloring her cheeks. This was the cruel prison of aphasia, the aftermath of a severe stroke that had left her mind perfectly intact but had stolen her ability to command language. She knew precisely what she wanted to say. The bridge between her brain and her tongue was simply broken. Mr. Dubois' smile tightened. "The fish, madam? The sea bass is excellent." He pointed to the most expensive item on the menu, his patience already wearing thin. Eleanor shook her head with a small, sharp motion, her frustration mounting. "No, She gave up, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She pointed to a glass of water on a neighboring table, a look of profound resignation settling over her features. From his vantage point, Alistair's jaw hardened into a line of granite. He saw it all: the manager's condescension, the averted glances from nearby tables, and the agonizing, familiar surrender in his mother's eyes. This was his test, a brutal, secret audit of the world's compassion. For months, he'd been bringing her to the city's finest establishments, unannounced and dressed down, just to see how she would be treated without the shield of her name. The results were invariably the same. She was treated like a problem to be managed, an inconvenience, a senile old woman. His heart twisted with a toxic cocktail of guilt and protective rage. He had built an empire that could move anything anywhere in the world, yet he couldn't bridge the few inches of silence between himself and his mother. Clara watched the exchange from her station, a painful knot tightening in her stomach. She wasn't seeing a wealthy matriarch or a difficult customer. She was seeing her grandfather, a proud, brilliant history professor, reduced to a state of desperate, maddening silence after his own stroke. She remembered the hours she had spent with him, not trying to make him speak, but simply learning to listen differently, to the intent in his eyes, the story in his gestures, the subtle shift in his breathing. She had learned the language of the lost connection. Mr. Dubois gave Eleanor a curt nod, scribbled "water" on his pad, and stalked away, muttering to a passing busboy about time wasters. The rule at Aurelia was absolute: never engage unless engaged, maximize turnover, and never, ever make a scene. But Clara felt an imperative that superseded any house rule. It was a pull of shared humanity, a refusal to let that proud, intelligent woman drown in her own silence. Taking a steadying breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Clara straightened her apron. She picked up a small notepad and a pen and walked toward the most important table in the restaurant. The air around it felt brittle with tension. Mr. Dubois saw her approaching, and his eyes widened in apoplectic fury. Alistair, from the bar, tensed, his entire body language shifting from passive observation to sharp, predatory focus. He expected her to try and upsell, to rush his mother, to be just another cog in the machine of dismissive service. Clara ignored them all. Her focus was entirely on Eleanor. She approached the table not with a waitress's haste, but with a quiet, unhurried calm. She didn't speak. Instead, she knelt slightly, bringing herself to eye level with the seated woman, a gesture of respect that instantly eased the tense power dynamic. She offered a small, gentle smile. "Hello," she said, her voice soft. "My name is Clara. It looks like you're having a frustrating evening. Sometimes the words just don't want to come out and play fair, do they?" Eleanor looked up, startled. The girl wasn't speaking loudly. She wasn't simplifying her language. She was acknowledging the struggle itself, naming the demon without pity or condescension. Clara placed the notepad on the table. "We don't need the words," she continued calmly. "Let's try something else. Just use your eyes. Is what you want to eat something warm?" Eleanor's eyes, which had been clouded with shame, cleared. She held Clara's gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes." "Good, that's a start," Clara said, her smile widening. "Is it meat?" A slight shake of the head. "No." "Fish?" Another shake. "No." "Something like chicken or pasta." As she said the word chicken, Eleanor's eyes lit up with a spark of recognition. She nodded more emphatically this time. "Wonderful," Clara said, making a small note. "Now this part is harder. Think about how it tastes. Is there a sauce? Something creamy?" "No." "Something bright? Like with lemon?" A flicker of confirmation in her eyes. A small nod. "Yes." "And vegetables? Like potatoes?" "No." "Greens? Like beans or maybe—" Clara paused, her mind racing through the restaurant's vast pantry. "Asparagus?" At the word asparagus, Eleanor's entire face transformed. A radiant, relieved smile broke through the clouds of her frustration. She pointed at Clara and then gave a thumbs up, a gesture so full of life and gratitude it was breathtaking. Clara smiled back, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "Roasted chicken with lemon and asparagus," she summarized. "It's not on the menu, but I know the chef. He used to make it for the staff. It's simple, but it's perfect. Would that make you happy?" Eleanor Finch didn't need words. She reached out and placed her frail, trembling hand over Clara's and nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. From across the room, the world had tilted on its axis for Alistair Finch. He hadn't just witnessed good service. He had witnessed a miracle of communication, a quiet act of translation more profound than any technology his billions could buy. This young woman hadn't managed his mother's disability. She had bypassed it entirely. She had listened to her silence and heard perfectly what she wanted to say. In that moment, the waitress hadn't just taken an order. She had given his mother back a piece of her own humanity. And Alistair Finch, a man who dealt in the currency of power and control, was utterly, completely, and irrevocably floored. The hush that fell over Alistair was internal, a deafening silence where the gears of his cynical mind had ground to a halt. He had spent the last 2 years and a small fortune on the country's leading neurologists and speech therapists. He had installed state-of-the-art communication software on tablets that his mother despised, and had sat through countless excruciating sessions trying to decipher her fragmented attempts at speech, his own impatience a toxic presence in the room. Yet this waitress, with nothing but a notepad, a pen, and a reservoir of empathy he couldn't begin to comprehend, had achieved more in 3 minutes than he had in 2 years. He pushed himself off the bar and crossed the room, his long strides eating up the plush carpet. Mr. Dubois intercepted him, his face a mask of panic. "Mr. Finch, I am so sorry. I will handle this waitress immediately. Her behavior is completely unacceptable." Alistair silenced him with a glance so cold it could have frozen champagne. "You will do nothing," he said, his voice a low growl. "Go back to your station, now." Dubois scurried away, his face pale. Clara, seeing the tall, imposing figure of the man from the bar approach, felt a jolt of fear. She quickly stood up, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Sir, I apologize if I overstepped. I was only trying to assist the—" "I saw what you were trying to do," Alistair cut in, his voice softer than she expected, though still laced with an intense analytical edge. He wasn't looking at her, but at his mother. Eleanor was watching Clara with an expression of open adoration, her posture relaxed for the first time all evening. He finally turned his gaze to Clara, and she felt the full, unnerving force of his attention. "My mother has expressive aphasia," he stated, the clinical term sounding stark and brutal in the opulent room. "Her mind is unaffected. Her ability to form words is not." "I know," Clara said quietly. "My grandfather had it, after his stroke." The admission hung in the air, instantly reframing everything. This wasn't a lucky guess or a clever customer service trick. This was born of experience, of love, of loss. Alistair's expression shifted, the hard suspicion in his eyes softening almost imperceptibly into something else. Intrigue. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara Mayhew, sir." Before he could say more, Eleanor tugged at his sleeve. She looked at Clara, then pointed to the empty chair at her table, her expression an unmistakable invitation. It was a gesture of such profound hope that it sent a pang through Alistair's chest. His mother hadn't willingly invited a stranger to her table in years. "Please," Alistair said, gesturing to the chair. It was not a request. "Sit." "Sir, I can't possibly," Clara stammered, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes now watching them. "I'm on duty. Mr. Dubois would—" "Mr. Dubois works for a company I happen to own a significant stake in," Alistair said flatly, a fact that was news to everyone, including a now hyperventilating Dubois. "As of this moment, you are no longer on duty. You are my guest." He signaled to a passing sommelier. "Bring a bottle of the 2005 Montrachet and add a $5,000 bonus to the kitchen staff's pool tonight for their excellent chicken." Overwhelmed, Clara slowly sank into the velvet chair, feeling as though she had slipped into an alternate reality. For the next hour, a strange and wonderful scene unfolded. The kitchen, spurred by the astronomical bonus, produced the most sublime roasted chicken Clara had ever tasted. Eleanor ate with a joy that seemed to emanate from her very soul, periodically stopping to smile at Clara, a silent thank you that spoke volumes. The conversation was stilted, yet profound. Alistair, accustomed to commanding conversations, found himself in a secondary role. He would ask his mother a question, and she would answer through a series of gestures, facial expressions, and single hard-won sounds with Clara patiently translating. "She says the lake looks beautiful tonight," She says it reminds her of Lake Geneva, where she and your father honeymooned. Through Clara, Alistair heard his mother's voice for the first time since the stroke. He learned she hated the physical therapist he'd hired, that she missed the scent of the peonies in her old garden, that the silence she feared most was not her own, but the silence of people giving up on her. He also found himself watching Clara. He noted the way she never spoke down to his mother, the way she would rephrase a question 3, 4, 5 times without a hint of frustration. He saw the intelligence in her eyes as she pieced together fragments of meaning into a coherent whole. She wasn't just empathetic, she was brilliant, a linguistic detective of the highest order. Marcus Thorne, his slick, calculating cousin, had always told him to be wary of people, that everyone had an angle. What, he wondered, was this girl's angle? The question gnawed at him, a default setting of suspicion he couldn't turn off. As the evening drew to a close, Alistair knew a large tip would be a gross insult to what had transpired. This wasn't a service. It was a resurrection. An idea, audacious and unconventional, began to form in his mind. "Miss Mayhew," he began, leaning forward, "I have a proposition for you." Clara's heart fluttered with anxiety. "Sir?" "My family's philanthropic arm, the Finch Foundation, is holding its annual board meeting in 1 month. My mother is the chairwoman. It is, for all intents and purposes, the most important day of her professional year. For the last 2 years, she has attended as a silent figurehead, nodding while I, speak for her." He paused, his gaze intense. "I want to change that. I want you to work for me, for the next month, as my mother's communication companion. I want you to help her prepare, to understand the reports, to formulate her questions, to find her voice so she can preside over that meeting as she is meant to." He named a figure then, a number so astronomical it seemed to suck the air from Clara's lungs. It was more than the entirety of her grandfather's remaining medical debt. It was a new life, a clean slate, the possibility of returning to school. It was an escape hatch from a life of quiet desperation. Before she could process it, Eleanor reached across the table and grasped her hand. Her grip surprisingly strong. Her clear blue eyes were pleading. She couldn't say the words, but her intent was unmistakable. "Please, don't leave me." Looking from the son's calculated, intense stare to the mother's raw, hopeful plea, Clara knew her life had just irrevocably fractured. The path she had been on had vanished, replaced by this terrifying, brilliant, and completely unknown road. "Yes," she said, her voice a near whisper. "I accept." The following morning, Clara's world shifted from the muted grays of her financial struggles to the intimidating high-definition gloss of the Finch estate in Lake Forest. A sleek, silent town car, a stark contrast to the rattling L train she usually took, transported her through iron gates and up a winding, tree-lined drive to a mansion that seemed carved from limestone and old money. The air itself felt different, cleaner, quieter, heavier. She was met at the soaring oak doors by a woman who introduced herself as Victoria Thorne, Alistair's cousin and the executive director of the Finch Foundation. Victoria was the epitome of polished perfection, from her severe blonde bob to her impeccably tailored suit and the condescending smile that never quite reached her cold, assessing eyes. "Clara, so you're the one," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a honeyed disdain as her gaze swept over Clara's simple off-the-rack dress. "Alistair is so impulsive, a real diamond in the rough," he said. "We're all just thrilled to see what you can do for dear Aunt Eleanor." The implication was clear. Clara was a curiosity, a project, a temporary amusement. The house was a museum of quiet elegance, vast sunlit rooms filled with antique furniture, priceless art, and a chilling, sterile silence. It felt less like a home and more like a beautiful, gilded cage. She found Eleanor in a sprawling glass conservatory, surrounded by hundreds of orchids. The moment Eleanor saw her, her face erupted in a smile of such genuine, unadulterated relief that it instantly dispelled the room's coldness. Eleanor, using a gesture for Clara's name that she had clearly invented, a simple C that brushed across her heart, signed, "You came," I was afraid I had dreamed you." "I am real," Clara assured her, speaking and gesturing, falling into the rhythm of their unique communication. "And I am here to work." Their days settled into a routine. In the mornings, they would sit in the grand library while Clara painstakingly went through the Foundation's dense quarterly reports, breaking down complex financial data into a series of simple yes-no questions and visual aids for Eleanor. In the afternoons, they would walk in the sprawling gardens, where Eleanor, using gestures and pointing, would teach Clara the names of flowers, sharing memories of planting them with her late husband. For the first time since her stroke, Eleanor was not a patient to be managed, but a mind to be engaged. Clara discovered a sharp, inquisitive intellect, a dry wit, and a formidable will that had been lying dormant. Eleanor, in turn, began to flourish. The frustrated, defeated woman from the restaurant was replaced by a confident matriarch, her eyes sparkling with renewed purpose. Alistair was a frequent, yet distant observer. He would appear unannounced, standing in the doorway of the library or watching them from a window as they walked in the garden. He said little, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism, but Clara could feel his intense scrutiny. His initial suspicion had not vanished. It had simply morphed into a state of watchful waiting. He was a man who trusted data, not emotion, and Clara was an anomaly he could not yet quantify. Victoria, however, was a constant, unnerving presence. She would interrupt their sessions with flimsy excuses, her smile always tight, her questions for Clara always barbed. "Isn't it just amazing how you have this knack?" she'd say. "It's almost too good to be true." She made a point of discussing Clara's exorbitant salary within her earshot, framing it as a wildly extravagant expense. The first major confrontation came a week into Clara's stay. They were reviewing a large grant proposal for a new inner-city arts program. Eleanor, after careful review with Clara, became agitated. She tapped a line item in the budget, an enormous consulting fee paid to a company Clara didn't recognize. Eleanor shook her head vehemently, trying to form a word. "We're wrong." Victoria, who had entered the library, laughed it off. "Oh, Aunt Eleanor, don't you worry your head about that. It's just standard administrative overhead. A bit of boring paperwork." But Clara, guided by Eleanor's insistent gaze, pressed on. "Mrs. Finch seems to feel the amount is incorrect. Perhaps we could see the invoice for this consulting fee." Victoria's smile froze on her face. "That's highly irregular. I handle the financials. This is precisely why we can't have you overexciting her, Clara. She gets confused." "She is not confused," a deep voice said from the doorway. Alistair had been standing there listening. "She is asking a question. Get the invoice, Victoria." The venom in Victoria's eyes as she looked at Clara was palpable. She had underestimated the waitress, and she had underestimated her aunt. Clara wasn't just a companion. She was an interpreter, a conduit. She was giving Eleanor her power back, and for Victoria, that was an existential threat. That night, Victoria went to Alistair's study. "I'm worried, Alistair," she began, her voice a symphony of feigned concern. "This girl, Clara, she has so much influence over Eleanor. We know nothing about her. What if she's manipulating her? Planting ideas? For all we know, she could be after the Finch fortune. A desperate girl with a sad story is the oldest play in the book." "She helped Mother," Alistair stated, his eyes on his computer screen. "Or she made you think she did," Victoria countered, placing a manicured hand on his desk. "A woman with her skills of persuasion. It's a bit unsettling, don't you think? I'm just saying, for your mother's protection, we should know who we're dealing with. A simple background check would put all our minds at ease." Alistair finally looked up, his expression unreadable. The seed of doubt, always present in the cynical soil of his mind, had been watered. He had built his empire by anticipating betrayal and mitigating risk. He had made this decision about Clara based on a gut feeling, an emotion, a variable he distrusted above all others. "Fine," he said, his voice flat. "Do it." As Victoria left his study, a triumphant smirk touched her lips. She knew exactly what a background check on a poor girl from Pilsen with a mountain of debt would uncover. And she knew exactly how to frame that story of struggle, not as one of resilience, but as a portrait of a desperate and dangerous grifter. The weeks leading up to the board meeting became a silent, undeclared war. Outwardly, everything was calm. Clara and Eleanor's bond deepened into a genuine friendship, a quiet alliance against the cold opulence that surrounded them. Clara learned about Eleanor's past as a fierce advocate for public libraries, a passion that had been silenced along with her voice. Eleanor, in turn, discovered Clara's abandoned dream of becoming a speech pathologist, her eyes filling with a fierce, protective anger on Clara's behalf. With Clara as her interpreter, Eleanor began making phone calls, reconnecting with old friends and colleagues, her world slowly expanding beyond the gilded walls of the estate. Victoria, meanwhile, waged her campaign in the shadows. She would subtly question Alistair, dropping poisonous little remarks. Did you know the waitress's father was a notorious gambler? It seems a talent for playing the odds runs in the family. Or, it's so sad about her debt. A person in that position might be tempted to do anything for a way out. Alistair found himself caught in an emotional crossfire. He saw the undeniable positive transformation in his mother. She was alive again, engaged, happy. He owed that to Clara. He even found himself drawn to Clara's quiet strength, her unwavering integrity. One evening, he found her in the conservatory, staring at a rare blooming orchid. "It's a Paphiopedilum Rothschildianum," he said, coming to stand beside her. "My father bought it for my mother on their 25th anniversary." "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. "It must have taken incredible patience to get it to bloom." "My father was a patient man," he replied, a rare note of warmth in his voice. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the fragrant air thick with unspoken things. He saw her not as an employee, but as a woman. He felt a pull, a dangerous spark of attraction that his logical mind immediately tried to extinguish. This was a business arrangement, a complication he couldn't afford. The day before the board meeting, Victoria presented Alistair with a thick, leather-bound file. "The background check you authorize," she said, her voice grave. "I think you need to see this." "I'm so sorry, Alistair. It's worse than I imagined." He opened the file. Inside was not just data, but a narrative, carefully crafted by Victoria. It detailed the crushing debt left by Clara's father, the foreclosure on their family home, the high-interest loans taken out in her name, but it was framed with insidious annotations, pattern of financial desperation. History of family instability. It included a heavily edited transcript of an interview with a disgruntled former co-worker from a diner Clara had worked at years ago, claiming she was always looking for an easy way out. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, painting a portrait of a cunning predator who had identified the Finches as her ultimate prize. Every cynical instinct Alistair possessed roared to life. This was the pattern he understood. This was the world as he knew it. People with nothing trying to take from people with everything. The genuine connection he'd witnessed, the spark he'd felt. It must have all been part of the act. A masterful, long con. The hurt was sharp and surprising, a feeling of personal betrayal that went far beyond business. He felt like a fool. The day of the board meeting arrived, gray and overcast, mirroring Alistair's mood. The Foundation's boardroom was an imposing space of dark mahogany and leather, dominated by a massive table. The board members, titans of industry and society, filed in. Clara arrived with Eleanor, who was dressed in a powerful navy blue suit, her expression calm and resolute. Clara, in a simple gray dress, felt a sense of quiet pride. They had prepared for this for a month. Eleanor was ready, but as she saw Alistair standing by the window, his back to the room, she felt a chill. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of cold fury. The warmth from the conservatory was gone, replaced by the glacial ice of a winter lake. He walked directly to her, ignoring his mother completely. "A word," he said, his voice low and menacing. "In the anteroom, now." Confused, Clara followed him into the small adjoining office. He closed the door behind them, the soft click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. He threw the leather-bound file onto a small table. $100,000, he began, his voice seething with controlled rage. "That's quite a prize for a girl from Pilsen. But I suppose it was never about the salary, was it? This was just the down payment." Clara stared at him, her blood turning to ice. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, spare me the innocent act, he sneered. The performance is over. I've read all about you, Clara Mayhew. The mountain of debt. The gambling father. You saw us coming a mile away, didn't you? A lonely old woman and her guilty billionaire son. The perfect marks. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space. Every gentle smile, every patient moment, it was all an act. You preyed on my mother's vulnerability, and you preyed on my hope. You weaponized her silence against us. Tell me, what was the next step? Seducing the son? Convincing my mother to write you into her will? The sheer venomous cruelty of his accusations struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. He had taken her entire life, her struggles, her deepest pains, and twisted them into something monstrous and ugly. The trust Shahanosha. The burn of unshed tears was a corrosive acid behind Clara's eyes, but she would not grant him the victory of their fall. The fear that had seized her in the anteroom, that cold, paralytic dread of a cornered animal, underwent a strange alchemy. It transmuted, hardening into a diamond core of outrage, sharp and pure. She straightened her spine, a subtle shift that felt like drawing a sword, and met his glacial stare with a fire he had not anticipated. You are wrong, she said. Her voice, to her own surprise, was not a whisper, but a low, resonant chord of absolute certainty. It did not tremble. You are so profoundly lost in the gilded canyons of your own making, so steeped in suspicion that you mistake it for wisdom, that you can no longer recognize truth when it kneels before you. You look at me and you don't see a person. You see a vulnerability in your portfolio, a variable to be neutralized. You see a mirror of your own hollow, transactional world where every act of kindness has a price and every soul is for sale. She took a step toward the table where the leather-bound file lay like a coiled serpent. She did not touch it. To touch it would be to acknowledge its reality, to give its poison purchase. You think that portfolio gives you insight into a life, into suffering? My father's debts were not a strategy, Mr. Finch. They were a cancer, a disease of hope that metastasized into despair, and it consumed him. It almost consumed us. The patience I learned, the patience you witnessed and decided was a performance, was forged in the crucible of that loss. It was learned in the sacred, agonizing silence of my grandfather's bedside, a lesson in listening for the soul when the words are gone. It is a language of love, a language you will never, ever understand, because you have never been forced to learn it. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity, each word a carefully aimed dart meant to pierce his armor of wealth and cynicism. For a moment, I actually pitied you. I saw a man haunted by a silence he couldn't bridge, trying desperately to reach his mother across an impossible divide. I was wrong again. You aren't lonely. You're just empty. A coward hiding behind spreadsheets and background checks, so pathologically terrified of being made a fool that you would rather incinerate something genuine than risk the audacity of believing in it. She turned from him then, a final, complete dismissal. Her hand closed around the cold brass of the doorknob. As for your money, the check you were so certain I was chasing, you can keep it. Keep all of it. Consider it payment for the final, invaluable lesson you've taught me. My work here is concluded. I gave your mother her voice back. What you and your board of directors, what your world chooses to do with it, is no longer my concern. I will not be your project, your villain, or your redemption. I will not take one single dollar for the privilege. She pulled the door open and stepped back into the charged atmosphere of the boardroom, her chin high, her gaze fixed on a point beyond them all. She walked past the rows of stunned, powerful faces, past a slack-jawed Victoria whose expression was a sickening amalgam of triumph and confusion, and did not stop. She did not look back at the man she left standing alone in the anteroom, drowning in the wreckage of his certainty, the echo of her truth a deafening roar in the sudden, crushing silence. The walk from the Finch Foundation's tower to the L station was a fugue state. The biting November wind off the lake was a physical slap, a welcome shock that grounded her in the brutal reality of the moment. The city's cacophony, the scream of sirens, the rumble of the train overhead, the chorus of 1,000 hurried conversations, was a mercy, filling the space where Alistair's accusations still echoed. She boarded the train, a ghost in a simple gray dress, and sank into a worn plastic seat, invisible among the weary commuters. The opulence of the last month, the scent of orchids and lemon polish, the hushed reverence of the mansion, now felt like a fever dream. Here, surrounded by the cracked linoleum and the weary authentic faces of her city, was the life he had dissected and deemed a threat. Here was the truth. The tears finally came, hot and silent, tracking clean paths through the grime on the window she leaned against. They were not tears of weakness, but of a profound and hollow grief. Not for the lost money, but for the lost hope. She had allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, in a bridge, and he had dynamited it from his side of the chasm. For Alistair, the silence Clara left behind was a living entity. It pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. He re-entered the boardroom to a scene of chaos. His mother, her face a mask of stone, was standing. She held the meeting's agenda in her hands, and with a slow, deliberate act of breathtaking finality, she tore the thick document precisely in half. The sound ripped through the room. She dropped the pieces onto the mahogany table, turned, and without a single glance at her son, walked regally from the room. Her exit was not a retreat, it was a judgment rendered. It was the loudest, most eloquent statement she had made in 2 years. Without her, I am silent, and my silence is your answer. The days that followed were an exercise in exquisite torment. The mansion, once a symbol of his power, became his prison. A profound, weaponized quiet settled over the estate. Eleanor remained in her wing of the house. She did not lock her door, which was somehow worse. It was an open invitation he could not bring himself to accept, a silent testament to his disgrace. He would see her sometimes, a solitary figure in the vast, manicured gardens, her lavender cardigan a small splash of color against the graying landscape. If she saw him watching from a window, she would simply turn her back and continue her slow, determined walk. Clara's words became his jailers, replaying in an endless, torturous loop. A coward hiding behind his money. He paced the length of his study, the plush Aubusson carpet feeling like miles of broken glass. He had built a global empire on the principle of mitigating risk, of anticipating betrayal, of trusting data over instinct, and that very system, that core tenet of his identity, had led him to this catastrophic failure. He had looked at Clara's life, a tapestry of resilience woven from threads of pain and sacrifice, and his system had analyzed it as a threat profile. He had not seen a survivor. He had seen a predator. He had not seen love. He had seen leverage. Victoria tried to capitalize on the chaos, her voice a constant, sympathetic poison in his ear. "I'm so sorry, Alistair. I told you she was unstable. It's for the best. We'll find a proper, vetted companion for Eleanor." But for the first time, her words sounded false, her sympathy tinny and rehearsed. A tiny, dissonant detail began to gnaw at him, a loose thread in the narrative she had so expertly woven. It was the memory from the library, before the board meeting, before Clara. His mother's agitation, the way she had stabbed her finger at that single line item, the consulting fee. It had been a moment of pure, unadulterated communication. It was the only clue she had been able to give him, and in his arrogance, he had ignored it. On the 4th day of his exile, he did not call his usual team of private investigators. He did not want another curated narrative. He summoned a man named Kenzie from his corporation's headquarters. Kenzie was not an investigator. He was a forensic accountant, a pale, bloodless creature who moved through balance sheets the way a shark moves through water, sensing the slightest drop of blood, the smallest irregularity. Alistair gave him a single directive. Find the source and destination of every dollar paid to Thorne Consulting Group from the Finch Foundation over the last 5 years. He didn't tell Kenzie it was his cousin's company. He wanted the cold, unvarnished data. He wanted the truth, no matter how much it cost him. While Alistair waited for the axe to fall, Clara was trying to piece her life back together. She couldn't return to Aurelia. The thought of moving through that opulent silence, of serving men who resembled Alistair, was unbearable. She quit, taking a temporary job stocking shelves at a local bookstore, the scent of paper and ink a comforting balm. The weight of her debt settled back onto her shoulders, heavier than before, because now she knew the lightness of its absence. But the deepest wound was the violation. He had taken her most sacred pains and held them up as proof of her corruption. He had used her love for her grandfather as evidence against her. That was the part that festered, the part that woke her up in the cold pre-dawn hours. To heal, she knew she had to reclaim that part of herself. She started volunteering at a small community center in Pilsen, a place that ran a support group for stroke survivors and their families. It was there, sitting on a folding chair in a brightly lit church basement, patiently helping a proud, frustrated carpenter learn to communicate with a picture board, that she began to feel the first stirrings of her own spirit returning. This was real. This was the work she was meant to do. Kenzie's report arrived a week later, not in a leather-bound file, but as a sterile, encrypted data stick. Alistair opened it in the dead of night, the only light in his study the cold blue glow of the monitor. The truth was not a single shocking revelation, but a slow, methodical tide of filth that rose and rose until it submerged him. For 5 years, since the day Eleanor's signature had become a rubber stamp, Victoria had been systematically siphoning millions. The Shell Corporation was a masterpiece of deceit, funneling money through a labyrinth of offshore accounts. But it was the victims that broke him. She hadn't stolen from the Foundation's large corporate grantees who had their own auditors. She had stolen from the small ones, an inner-city music program that had its funding halved, a literacy project for immigrants that had folded, a free clinic whose expansion was mysteriously canceled. She had stolen from the voiceless, the vulnerable, the very people the Foundation was created to serve. The final piece clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. Victoria's campaign against Clara hadn't been about protecting the family. It had been about protecting her empire of fraud. Clara, with her unique ability to give Eleanor her voice back, wasn't a threat to Alistair's wallet. She was an existential threat to Victoria's entire criminal enterprise. The background check, the whispered poisons, the expertly crafted narrative of the desperate grifter, it had all been a preemptive strike. And he, Alistair Finch, the master strategist, the man who saw every angle, had not been the target. He had been the weapon. She had loaded the gun with his own cynicism and pointed him exactly where she wanted him to fire. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him so intensely he had to grip the edge of his desk. He saw Clara's face in the boardroom, the fury and the profound, unforgivable hurt in her eyes. He had not just been mistaken, he had been a monster, an accomplice. An apology was less than nothing. Words were the cheap currency he dealt in every day. Restitution, he knew with a soul-deep certainty, had to be a language she would understand. It had to be an act of building. It had to be a bridge. 2 weeks later, he stood in the doorway of the Pilsen Community Center. He was not alone. Beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, was Eleanor. The sight of them, the severe, imposing billionaire, and the quiet, elegant matriarch, caused a ripple of silence to spread through the cheerful chaos of the room. He saw Clara immediately. She was sitting at a table with an elderly man, her head bent close to his, her expression one of utter, gentle concentration. She looked up, and for a heart-stopping moment, her eyes met his. There was no anger in them, only a weary, guarded surprise. He and his mother did not approach her directly. They spoke first to the center's director, Maria. As Alistair laid out his proposal, Maria's expression shifted from disbelief to astonishment, and finally to tears. Only then did they walk towards Clara's table. The elderly man looked up at them, confused, and Clara gave his hand a reassuring pat. She stood not in deference, but as an equal, her posture radiating a quiet dignity that made the cavernous boardroom feel 1,000 miles away. Clara, Alistair began, and the name was a raw, unfamiliar sound in his mouth. I know that I have no right to be here. I have no right to ask you for anything. What I did, it was not a mistake. A mistake is an error in judgment. What I did was a failure of character. It was cruel, and it was unforgivable. He looked at her, his own gaze stripped of all its usual armor, leaving only a vast and desolate landscape of remorse. Victoria has been removed. There will be legal consequences. The stolen money is being restored to the programs it was meant for. But that is just housekeeping. It doesn't change the fact that I took your life, your history of pain, and I twisted it into a weapon to hurt you. I saw your strength, and I chose to call it a deception. There is no excuse for that. There will never be an excuse. Eleanor stepped forward slightly. She held a large portfolio, not of leather, but simple pressed cardboard. She offered it to Clara. Hesitantly, Clara took it. She opened it. Inside were not financial reports, but architectural renderings. Blueprints for a new state-of-the-art wing on the community center. Plans for a fully endowed institution at the city's largest university. The Eleanor Finch Center for Communication Science and Disorders, dedicated to providing therapy to all, regardless of income, and to funding research into aphasia. And on the final page, a single sheet of paper detailing the charter for its primary scholarship, a full-ride grant designed to support students who had faced personal hardship. It was named the Clara Mayhew Grant. Clara looked up from the pages, her eyes shimmering with a profound, complex emotion that was beyond tears. He hadn't just thrown money at the problem. He had listened. He had heard every unspoken dream, every abandoned passion she had shared with his mother in the quiet afternoons in the garden, and he had built them a home. He had forged his apology out of steel and glass and human potential. The center, Alistair said, his voice quiet, almost breaking. It needs a director of research and patient advocacy. Someone who understands that communication is more than words. Someone who knows how to listen to the silence and find the person inside. Someone with integrity. Someone. He trailed off, unable to finish. He was not offering her a job. He was not offering her money. He was offering her the chance to build a world where what happened to her, to his mother, to her grandfather, would be less likely to happen to others. He was offering her a purpose, her own dream, resurrected and made real. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not a void, but a space filled with immense, unspoken weight. It was the space where a new world could be built, or the old one left to crumble. Clara looked from Alistair's haunted, hoping face to Eleanor's steady, knowing gaze. She thought of the men and women in this room. She thought of her grandfather. A slow, tremulous smile touched her lips. She closed the portfolio and held it to her chest. She took a single step forward, closing the last few inches of the vast distance that had separated them. "It begins with listening," she said, her voice clear and strong, a promise to them both. "Let's begin."